Howdy. Howdy. Well, tonight is a real treat for all of us, and I'm delighted that we could be joined by Chancellor and Mrs. Sharp, by Mrs. Flores, by Fred and Harriet McClure. I think you all know Fred is the CEO of the George Bush Library Foundation, and College Station's own Mayor Berry and Dr. Berry. Thank you for joining us. Tonight we're going to be hearing from David Axelrod. As you all know, David Axelrod was senior advisor to President Obama. He was senior advisor to the Obama-Biden transition, and he was senior strategist for the historic 2008 campaign that elected President Obama, as well as his re-election in 2012. He currently heads the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago, along with a few other things in his spare time. I think all of you recall David Axelrod, in many ways the face of the administration during his years in the White House. He was on every major Sunday talk show multiple times. The Daily Show, The Night Show, The Late Show, and shows named after other hours of the day. In 25 years, David Axelrod managed media strategy and communications for over 150 campaigns at every level. That included President Obama's successful run for the Senate, a success that really no one expected. Prior to joining political life, David Axelrod was a working journalist, 8 years with the Chicago Tribune, giving him that unique and special perspective on political life in America. He and his wife Susan are very active in charitable causes. They helped found a group called Citizens United for research on epilepsy, which has raised over $15 million in the effort to find a cure for that awful disease. This evening, we will be witnesses to contemporary political history, hearing David Axelrod reflect on leadership lessons he absorbed during his time at the White House. Following his remarks, our own Andy Card will join him on stage for a conversation. In addition to stepping in for me as acting dean of the Bush School when I went off to Afghanistan, Andy Card served in the Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush administrations, Deputy Chief of Staff, and later Transportation Secretary for George H.W. Bush, and 6 years as Chief of Staff for George W. Bush. So we are doubly blessed this evening to have two persons with us who are not only witnesses to history, but made history. So please join me now in welcoming to the stage David Axelrod.
Thanks, Ambassador. There are so many reasons why I'm proud to be here, not the least of which is to be here with you and to be introduced by you. If there were a Hall of Fame for diplomats, you would be elected unanimously for all the service that you've provided to this country in the most challenging and perilous parts of of this country, of the world. And I really, really admire you, and I salute you for your public service. So thank you very much. I wanted to do something special for Texas, something that would be Texas appropriate. So, I mean, I don't know what your plans are, but I've actually planned a 21-hour speech today for you. You know, most of the analysis of Senator Cruz's filibuster was on the political ramifications of it and all of that. I was interested in the mechanics of it. I mean, how do you stand there for 21 hours without a bathroom break? And I'm thinking the last thing I'd be wanting to talk about is green eggs and ham under those circumstances. It's also great to be here with an old friend, your Chancellor, John Sharp. We worked together in 1998 on his race for lieutenant governor. Unfortunately, for lack of drive and ambition, we were not able to be successful. But he's overcome that now. He's done a great job as chancellor. The truth is that we ran a very good race in a very difficult election. Your governor then was a fellow named George W. Bush. He was getting 69% of the vote. I think we lost by less than 2%. I know that you can cite a precise number. But who was it that we ran in? What was the guy's name? Oh, Perry. Yeah. Titanic struggle between two Aggies, I remember. And what's he doing now? I'm also honored to be here at an institute named for someone I deeply admire, a great, great public official. When you think about the resume of George H.W. Bush as a congressman, as ambassador to China, ambassador to the UN, director of the CIA, vice president, and president, and chairman of the Republican National Committee to boot. Any one of those things would be a distinction. The fact that one person did all of them is truly extraordinary. And what makes it even more important is that he did it with great honor and integrity and decency. I had a chance to meet President Bush when he was running for president in the first time in 1980. I was a young reporter at the Chicago Tribune, and I was sent up to Wisconsin to cover the Republican primary for president. At this point in the process, Ronald Reagan was ascendant. Ambassador Bush was not on the upswing. And I went to cover a press conference he had, and a number of the reporters who were there had been on his plane and following his campaign until recently, when their offices decided that his chances were sufficiently diminished that they didn't want to spend the money to have them travel with him. And when the press conference was over, I'll never forget, he walked up to this group of reporters who had been traveling with him and were no longer. And he said, "Hey, it's great to see all you guys." He says, "You ought to come back. We have plenty of room on the plane." And then he leaned forward and said, "But you better do it quick, because if we screw this up, we're going to be in a Piper Cub." And I thought, well, you know, the people you appreciate the most in public life are the people who take what they do seriously, but don't take themselves too seriously. And I was so impressed with his grace, because it was a very difficult time for him. And I met him again 28 years later after the 2008 election. And the next President, Bush, was having a luncheon for the incoming President, Obama, and all the living presidents were there. And I stood in the Oval Office and watched as they took a ceremonial picture. And when it was over, Barack Obama called me and Robert Gibbs over, his press secretary, to meet George H.W. Bush, and he said, "Mr. President, these two guys helped me get elected." And he, and his face was so warm, and he said, "Nice going, boys." Just a nice, decent, honorable person. But the most important thing about him is the leadership that he showed as president. We saw it in the Gulf War, when he painstakingly assembled an international coalition to push back on the aggression of Saddam Hussein. But we also saw it, and this is particularly meaningful right now. I reached that point where I need a little background music. So I appreciate that. Was his decision in 1990 to support a budget, a compromise budget that called for higher taxes, something that he had said he wasn't going to do, and he came to the conclusion that this package was the right package, was necessary, and moved forward. And he absolutely knew when he signed that package that he was potentially imperiling his political career. But he thought it was the right thing for the country, and he went ahead and he did it. I think that his decision to do that had no small impact on the recovery of the economy and the strength of the economy in the 1990s. And yet he lost his bid for re-election, in part because he had to withstand a strong primary challenge. To me, that's how you define leadership. And I was saying to a group of students earlier that when you work in the White House, when you have the honor, the privilege of working in the White House, as I did, as Andy Card did, you leave with a much deeper respect for anyone who's ever served there, and particularly for the people who've served in the Oval Office, because it is a crushing, challenging job 24/7 from the time you take the office to the day you walk out the door. And I was always aware of that when I was there. And Andy knows that because he spent, in addition to serving in the cabinet, he spent 5 years at the side of the president. We all remember that iconic photo of Andy giving President Bush that dreadful news about what had happened in New York on 9/11, and we all know the pressures that followed that. It really changed our world in many ways. And I've seen this in my own experience in the White House. In fact, the night before the inauguration, I got a call. I was out to dinner with my wife and some friends, and I got a call from Rahm Emanuel, our incoming chief of staff, and he said, "Can you call me from a hard line?" I found a hard line. I called him. He said, "I'm going to tell you something that that hardly anybody knows or can know, but I spent the day with Chertoff and the Homeland Security people, and there's a real concern about a potential terrorist act in Washington on inaugural day." He filled me in on the details, asked me to prepare some remarks for the president in case the inaugural ceremonies had to be curtailed, told me to meet him behind the speaker's rostrum and give him this and not to talk to anybody about it. And I remember staying up. I could not sleep the night before. My wife, I was going to do television in the morning, and my wife and my son were going to go to church with the Bushes and the Obamas across the street from the White House. I stayed up all night wondering what was going to happen. And I heard sirens in Washington, which is not unusual, but I was wondering, could this be related? When my son and my wife left, I wanted to tell them not to go, but I was told not to say anything, and I didn't. And so, even before we took office, I got a sense of what the burdens and responsibilities of leadership were. By the way, Andy, when I was waiting for the president to give him this note, President Bush came in, George W. Bush, and I said to him, "Mr. President, I was on television this morning, and I want to tell you." He said, "Well, I don't watch television." I said, "Well, let me tell you what I said." And I said that you handled this transition like great patriots, and we're really so grateful. And that was true. Every one of our counterparts reached out for us. In my case, it was Ed Gillespie, and helped us make the adjustment, helped us make that transition. And I won't go into what he said to me, but he was very, very kind and encouraging to me. And it's something that it was a moment of grace that I will never forget. But it wasn't just the fear of a terrorist act or the possibility of a terrorist act, or the fact that we had two wars raging at the time that we took office. But we also entered office in the midst of the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. And we began coping with that even before we took office. On December 16th of 2008, we had a meeting at the transition office in Chicago. It was the president, the vice president, senior staff, and his incoming economic team. And the first speaker was Christy Romer, who was an expert on the Great Depression, and she had all these charts, and she's going through them. And she said, bottom line, Mr. President, is we're about to enter a recession that will be as deep as anything as we've experienced since the Great Depression. Larry Summers, who was the incoming head of the National Economic Council, said, Mr. President, this is going to put a hole of trillions in our GDP, and it's going to cause tremendous unemployment, and that's already begun. Tim Geithner, the incoming Treasury Secretary, said, Mr. President, the banks have locked up, and there's a real possibility that they may collapse. There's no credit being issued now. And then to cheer everybody up, the budget director, Peter Orszag, said, and by the way, this is going to increase our deficits by trillions of dollars between the money that we're going to have to generate to or spend to try and fight back, and depress tax revenues because of the recession. So at this point, I got up and walked out of the room and inquired as to whether we could demand a recount. And having satisfied myself that none was forthcoming, I went back into the room. And what happened after that was, from that day on, was that we became kind of an economic triage unit, and the president had to make a series of decisions, each of which was as unpopular as they were necessary. The first being the Recovery Act, exponentially larger emergency spending package than had ever been done before, and at a time when people were concerned about deficits, and we knew, and he knew, that this was going to be a difficult battle, and it would be not well received, but he was absolutely convinced that if we didn't undertake that the economy would continue to slide, and we needed to put a brake on the economy and create economic activity. And in fact, the Recovery Act did do that. We had to continue the TARP program that President Bush had started to keep the financial system from collapsing. And if the Recovery Act was unpopular, the TARP was toxic because so many Americans blamed the financial industry for the problems we were having, the irresponsibility of the financial industry. And their attitude was, you know what, when I make mistakes, when I screw up, I don't get bailed out. So why does Wall Street get bailed out? And it was, it was intuitively, you could understand that, but we didn't have the luxury of entertaining that because to let the financial system collapse would be the gateway to a second Great Depression. And by the way, Larry Summers rated in that first meeting in Chicago the chances of a second Great Depression as 1 in 3, which was really, really chilling. And then there was the bailout of the auto industry, which now, in retrospect, seems like a very shrewd decision. It's certainly popular in the recalling of it. At the time, though, it was terribly unpopular. Even in the state of Michigan, people opposed it. And for some of the same reason, they felt like the auto industry had made much of its own bad luck by making bad decisions over the course of a long period of time. And their thought was, well, my business doesn't get bailed out. Why does their business get bailed out? And I remember a discussion we had in the Roosevelt Room in the White House about a long discussion. I believe it was in late February or early March. And it was on a day that began, the president had an intelligence briefing involving some disturbing news from North Korea. And we met on the auto issue, and he said he wanted to have more discussion because he had to make a decision. Do we intervene or do we not? He went on to a meeting on the war in Afghanistan. I think Fargo was underwater that day from a flood. By the end of the day, I just collapsed in my chair, and I wondered whether this was secretly an an episode of The West Wing, the way things were going. But we had this meeting, and it went on for several hours on the auto bailout, and all the auto team, the economic advisors, some of the other policy advisors, and some of the political advisors. And my job was always to present the polling and to give him a sense of what public opinion was. And I said, look, everybody, this is a very, very negative decision in the minds of a lot of voters. I mentioned that even in Michigan, people were against it. I cited the figures. He listened, and he said, I know you're right, but, and I understand why they feel that way, but we're in the midst of the worst recession since the Great Depression. And if we let these companies collapse and let the supply chains that serve Ford collapse, we're going to lose another 1 million jobs. And we're going to lose an iconic American industry. And he said, and if we can move forward in a way that encourages the industry to rationalize itself, produce cars that people are willing to buy, and get everybody's buy-in and sacrifice from everybody involved, including the workers, then we should take the shot. And he did. And I always say, having given him that polling data, I always say one of the things that I like about him so much is that he listened to me so little. And that was one of those times. When I felt that way. On national security, by the way, I meant to mention before, it isn't just the things that it's the things that you anticipate. Like we knew, you don't know until you experience exactly what this means. We knew that terrorism was a threat. I never actually prepared in my thinking about moving to Washington that we were going to be dealing with pirates. Pirates was something I didn't expect, and then there's a movie out now about Captain Phillips, and that whole episode. And I was in the White House the day the president had to decide. National security people came to him and said, the SEALs have this boat in their sights. They're about 100 yards away. They're bobbing up and down on the water, but they think they can take out the pirates and save the captain. But they're bobbing up and down on the water, so there's no guarantee that they could take out the captain. And they said, but they got about 10 minutes. So you've got just 10 minutes to decide, Mr. President, what to do. And this is the life of a president. Every single day, presidents have to make these kinds of decisions. And frankly, they have to make them and be strong enough to live with the consequences of those decisions. I was in the White House the day before the SEALs took out Osama bin Laden. And of course, I was by now out of government. I didn't know what was going on, but I was in Washington because it was the White House Correspondents' Dinner. And as you probably know, part of the ritual of the White House Correspondents' Dinner is the president has to give a comedy speech, a comedic speech. And part of my job had been over the years to contribute to that. And so I went to work with the team and him on finishing the speech. And I was there for the dinner. I had lunch with him, and he talked about it. There had been terrible weather in Alabama the day before, and he had visited people there, and he was telling me about some of the people he had interacted with. He went down to Cape Canaveral for a launch that didn't happen, but Gabby Giffords was there because her husband was going up for the last time, and it was the first time the president had seen her since she had been shot, and he was talking about how much better she was doing than he ever imagined she could and how happy he was about that. And it was a perfectly normal discussion. And in the middle of it, a person from the National Security Council came in and said, and the president asked me to leave, and then we went back in. I went back in with the speechwriters, and we worked on the speech. We got halfway through the speech, and there was a joke about halfway through, and it was about a politician, a Republican politician, and who was running for president. And the joke was, such a promising guy, except for that unfortunate middle name, Bin Laden. And the president said, Bin Laden? He said, that's so yesterday. Let's take that out. And we didn't know. We thought it was pretty funny. We said, let's put something else in. and someone suggested something completely not funny. And he said, "That's great. Let's put that, let's put that in there." And so he went. He was great that night. Had some pretty good jokes at the expense of Donald Trump, who was thinking of running for president at the time. And that was sort of the end of his campaign that night. That's how good the president was. And then the next night, I was going to bed early, and my wife woke me up and said, "You better get up. I think they got bin Laden." And I looked at my BlackBerry. It was blowing up with messages from the White House. And I realized that whole time that I was with the president on that Saturday, he knew that he had given the order. He knew what was going to happen. And he knew that if it failed, that it was probably the end of his presidency, and more than that, a great disaster for national security. And he was perfectly calm. And that's what the presidency requires, because you have to make these life and death, sometimes momentous decisions, and you make them on the best information you have, and you use the best judgment you can muster, and then you hope for the best, and you need to be able to live with that. So that's part of leadership as well. Another has to do with healthcare, and I know that healthcare is a controversial subject right now, and particularly right here in the state of Texas. I know there's a lot of debate and discussion about it. I don't know why exactly, because I know you have a large number of uninsured here, but we can talk about that later. One of the proudest moments I remember was or not moments, but periods, was this whole healthcare debate in 2009 and 10, because it was very clear from the beginning, and again, I was in the role of saying, look, the politics are very challenging on this. I think this is going to be very, very hard. You're going to have to spend a lot of political currency. And understand, I was very sympathetic to doing healthcare reform, in part because I have a child who has a chronic illness, epilepsy, very serious, started when she was 7 months old. I was one of those Americans who almost went bankrupt because I had insurance, but it didn't cover her drugs, and her pharmaceuticals were costing about $1,000 a month, and I was working as a newspaper reporter on a very small salary. I couldn't get other insurance because she had a pre-existing condition. I understood the need for health reform in a very personal way, but my job, again, was to give him the political advice, and I said, I think this is going to be really, really hard. And we had a long discussion, and there were a lot of folks involved, and finally the president said, look, if we don't do this in the first 2 years, it's not going to get done. And if it doesn't get done, we had had a decade of double-digit health increases in health costs, and he said, it's going to continue that way. The system's going to implode. The government is going to implode because of healthcare costs. Families and businesses are going to implode because of healthcare costs. He said, we got to take the shot. He said, and I'll never forget this. He said, what are we here for? He said, do we just put our approval rating on the shelf and admire it for 8 years? Or are we going to draw down on it and try and make a difference? And as you know, what ensued was a very, very difficult, sometimes acrimonious fight. And I mean, healthcare was read the last rites, I don't know how many times. And each time it was his will that kept it going. I remember one time in the Oval Office, we were having a meeting on healthcare, and the president turned to Phil Shalero, his legislative advisor, and said, Phil, what do you think the chances of getting this done are? And Phil said, well, it depends on how lucky you feel, Mr. President. And the president just laughed and said, Phil, I'm a black guy named Barack Obama, and I'm president of the United States. There were many, many moments when people told him to fold his cards, to take something less, to give up and try again later. I went into his office in the summer of 2009, again with polling data, and we were standing in the middle of the Oval Office. He had just come back from a trip, and I went through it all, and he listened to everything I had to say. And one thing about him is that he is a good listener. Some politicians, and we have politicians here who can appreciate what I'm saying, kind of think that listening thing is the interlude between their chance to speak. But he's a good listener, and he listened to me very carefully, and he said, look, I believe you, and I know that we're taking on water. He said, but I just came back from Green Bay, Wisconsin, and I met a woman who was 36 years old. She's married, she has a job, she has 2 children, but now and insurance, but she has stage 4 breast cancer. Now she's hit her caps, and she's scared that she's going to die and leave her family bankrupt. By now I felt his hand in the small of my back, kind of leading me out of his office, and he said, this is not the country we believe in, so let's just keep fighting. And he did, and we did, and the night that we had the final vote in the House, we were all standing in that same Roosevelt room, which is adjacent to his office and where my office was. And as the final votes came in, I got up kind of unexpectedly to myself, and I walked into my office, I closed the door, and I kind of broke down and had a cry. And I thought to myself, well, you know, why? And I realized it was because I was absorbing the fact that because of what we had done, because of what he had done, that there were families in the future who wouldn't have to go through the agony that we went through, wouldn't have to wrestle with the problems that we wrestled through when my child was young. And that had real meaning to me. And it reminded me that the work we do had real meaning. And I went and I found the president when I collected myself, and I said, I want to thank you on behalf of the millions of families now and in the future who won't have to go through what my family went through. And he put his hand on my shoulder and he said, well, that's why we do the work. And that stuck with me. That's why we do the work. This all has... I talked at the beginning about why I'm proud to be here. I'm proud to be here especially because I believe public service matters. I believe this is why we do the work. And whatever your perspective is, you may have a different view of how we can advance this country's interests. But the work of doing that is good and noble work. And it means so much to me to be among young people who are committing their lives to that work. I just had an opportunity to spend time with about a dozen students of this institution. And honestly, I was kind of intimidated to go in the room when I read all that they've already done at their young ages. But you know, what I've done, and the ambassador mentioned it in the introduction, is when I finished the campaign in 2012, I started this Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago. It's an extracurricular program. I had gone to the University of Chicago 40 years before, painful to say. And it was a great university then as it is today. But I came to Chicago because they talked about the life of the mind, and I was interested in the life of the world. And I thought Chicago was an interesting political town. And I couldn't find any outlets for my interest. That's why I became a newspaper reporter, to sate my interest in politics. So I brought this institute back to the University of Chicago because I wanted to add a dimension that hadn't been there, a way to engage these really smart, well-motivated young people in public service, in politics, in the public arena. Because I say to them all the time, I mean, this is the most public-spirited group of young people that I've seen since I was a kid. And they really do want to make a difference. They really are thinking about things larger than themselves. But they rightfully look at our politics and they say, is this the way to make the difference? They've seen so many bad examples and they see so much carnage on television, and I'm sure that if you turn it on right now, you probably could see a pretty good example of that. And you know, but on the other hand, and what I always say to them is whatever it is that you care about, whether it's human rights or international development or climate change or deficits or education or promoting science, whatever it is that you care about is going to be impacted by the decisions that are made in Washington, in state capitals, in foreign capitals, in city halls, and the choice isn't really whether we turn and somehow that isn't going to be true. You can avert your eyes and walk away, but those decisions are still going to be made. The question really is, are you going to let those decisions happen without participating in shaping them, and then live with the consequences of your inaction? And so my message to young people there, and my message to young people here, although there I'm trying to encourage young people to think about lives in public service. Here people have made that decision, which is so inspiring. My message is get in there. I agree. Our politics, I think Andy would agree, our politics has taken a very bad turn. But the answer isn't to walk away. The answer is to get into it, get into the middle of the arena as candidates, as advisors, as policy people, as commentators, and as journalists, and help make it better. Help send it in the right direction. And institutions like this are a source of great hope. And the kids who go here are a source of great hope. And I hope that they will march forward in the tradition of great public servants like the two who are sitting here in the front row and the man for whom this institution is named, and help shape the world in a way that we can all be proud of. I'm confident that they will. So I really appreciate being here tonight. I look forward to my conversation with Andy and your questions, and let's get on with it.
Well, this has been a real treat. David, I think it would be great if people could understand how you, from New York City, the son of immigrant parents, could be so motivated to not only just pay attention, but get involved and then to make a big difference.
Yeah. Well, I mean, part of it may be being the son of an immigrant parent. My father was from Eastern Europe and fled during the pogroms in the early 20th century when he was 9 years old, and ultimately settled with his family in New York City. You know, I was always, and my mother's parents were, her father was an immigrant as well. They came here because they believed that America was different, and that in America they could worship freely, they could pursue their opportunities without discrimination and without paying bribes and without the hindrances that they faced, that they could build a future here. One thing, and I want to get back to the sort of history of this, but I will tell you, Andy, and you probably had this experience, I know the ambassador has, the most moving experience that I had when I was working for the president was when I traveled with him overseas and heard our national anthem on foreign soil. But it was particularly moving to me when I was in Moscow on July 6th, 2009, and I was in a row of dignitaries. How I got in a row of dignitaries, I don't know. And they were playing, the Russian Army band was playing our national anthem right in Red Square. And it was the eve of what would have been my father's 99th birthday. And I could not help but think about the faith that they had in America that caused them to go through all kinds of danger and heartache and turmoil to get there. And now here I was, my father's son, coming back as the senior advisor to the President of the United States, who happened to be an African-American man named Barack Obama. And I thought, you know, I was up in Canada the other day and someone was ripping on the country. And I told that story. I said, don't be so hard on America. I said, this is a special place, and I believe that deeply. I believe in America as an exceptional place. And so I always thought politics was important, but it really started for me, and I mentioned this to the kids earlier, when I was 5 years old. I lived in New York City. I lived in a housing development called Stuyvesant Town. Some of you may be familiar with it. It was built for returning war veterans. And in 1960, John F. Kennedy came campaigning there 10 days before the presidential election. And it tells you how different politics were then, that John F. Kennedy felt he had to campaign in New York 10 days before the presidential election. But New York was actually a swing state then. And this woman who took care of me, her name was Jessie Berry, African-American woman who came up to Harlem from the Great Migration, took care of me when my mother was at work, took me out, put me on top of a mailbox on 20th Street, which is a huge boulevard. I watched the street fill in with people, and then this very charismatic young guy standing on a platform, his voice was booming off the buildings, and I was 5, right, so I didn't know exactly what he was saying, but I knew it seemed important, and I watched everybody transfixed, just watching this guy. And I was hooked from that moment on, and that was my interest in politics began then. I worked for his brother Robert when he ran for the Senate. I handed out a few leaflets. And I wasn't a policy advisor. When I was 9 years old, when I was 10, I made a momentous decision. I broke with the Democratic Party because I thought they had slated kind of a hack for mayor. And I went to work for a young Republican congressman named John Lindsay, who was running for mayor of New York. And it went from there. But I always felt that this was a noble thing. This was a great calling to be involved in politics. And I did 8 years as a reporter. I was the political writer for the Chicago Tribune, covered City Hall, covered some great campaigns. And then in 1984, a fellow whose picture I think is up somewhere around here, Paul Simon, who was a congressman from Illinois, was running for the U.S. Senate, and he wanted me to come work for him. I became a little distressed about where I saw the newspaper business going, and nothing I've seen, by the way, since has dissuaded me of that. And I went to work for him, and we won a campaign against Charles Percy, who was a very prominent Republican, good guy, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, in the midst of the Reagan landslide. And I went over there as a communications director. Through a series of weird turns, I ended up as a campaign manager. I was 28 years old. And we won that race, and I started as a consultant after that, and working my way up for working for people like John Sharp.
Just like John Sharp. Texas A&M is a phenomenal campus. Our students are very committed to service.
Yes.
And they practice excellence and leadership and integrity and loyalty and have lots of respect.
And pretty good football.
But they give an awful, they're good at football. But selfless service has given great definition to a lot of people in Aggie land. And those people have given that same inspiration to others around, not only Texas, but around the world. And your involvement in the political process, you would not have been able to be successful if it weren't for volunteers in campaigns.
Yeah.
And I know that you worked as a volunteer in campaigns. And when listening to your conversation with the students, you talked about how you have to get involved, sometimes without pay.
Yeah.
To make a difference.
Often without pay.
And you said that that was kind of the opportunity that allowed you to grow as a professional in the political arena.
Well, I mean, the first thing I told them, if there are students here who are thinking about how to move forward in politics, my first advice was to find someone who you believe in, find someone who inspires you, find someone who stands for the things that you stand for and the direction you think your community or your state or your country should go, and work for that person. So follow your passion first, but then volunteer and do whatever you can. I told the story about John Favreau, the president's young speechwriter. John was 23 years old when he began working for Senator Obama in 2005. He had met him the previous year when he was a junior speechwriter for John Kerry, and they had actually sent him in at the convention to tell Obama that he had to give up his favorite line in his keynote speech because Kerry had a similar line. So the fact that they ended up working together was miraculous. Senator Obama was not happy about it. But John started with the Kerry campaign as a volunteer. He volunteered in the speechwriting office. I mean, I think he had other jobs to support himself, but he worked 24 hours a day, and he showed some promise, and he learned, and they started giving him writing assignments, and he began to move up a little, and there was And little by little, he made a reputation for himself that was good enough that when we were looking for a speechwriter, we reached out for him. And by the time he was 27 years old, he was the head speechwriter for the President of the United States. Now, I want to say as a disclaimer, not everyone's going to have that same experience. But it does speak to the fact that if you get involved and if you're passionate, your talent and your passion will be noticed, and you will move up quickly. So I encourage those who want to get into the political, take that political route to do that, to start that way.
The students were asked to submit questions, and several of the questions wanted to know how would you become a David Axelrod? How do you become a political consultant to make a difference and to put people into positions of responsibility and help them make a change? And so
Yeah, well, you know, the interesting thing in my history is that I was never trained for anything that I did.
neither was I.
Yeah, I know. Sometimes people are not surprised to hear that when I say that. You know, I was a voracious reader of newspapers when I was a kid because of my interest in politics and also my interest in sports. So it was a natural thing for me to want to write for newspapers. And I, in between my freshman and sophomore year in college, I went back to New York, and I must have gone to about 75 different news organizations, just begging for some, you know, entry-level internship. And I finally found a newspaper in Greenwich Village that was hard on its luck, that didn't have much of a staff and needed somebody who would do everything, and paid me $50 a week. And I stayed there for 6 months and learned a lot. Came back to Chicago, went to a newspaper where the University of Chicago is a community newspaper in Hyde Park, and this very great guy who ran the place looked me up and down, took the measure of me, and he said, "So you say you're interested in politics?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm interested in politics." He said, "You think you know a lot about it?" I said, "I think I know a lot about it, yeah." He says, "Well, we had a political columnist, and he just left. So we got an opening, and I'll pay you $25 a week to write a political column." So I was 19 then. And, you know, like a person with a little bit more perspective on himself might have said, "You know, I'm not ready for that." But I didn't. I took the job. And you know, that led to a job at the Tribune. And the Tribune job led to a job in politics. When I was in the Simon campaign, I was in charge of the strategic elements of the campaign, worked very closely with a media consultant. You remember Bob Squire was a very famous Democratic media consultant. Learned a lot from them. And I audaciously decided after that, hey, I could, because I helped work on the ads and the strategy, I said, I could write ads. I'm sure I could do that. So someone lent me a room in their law firm, and I and two other people started this firm. And we started on tiny little races. I remember my first winning race was for a county commissioner race in Chicago, this reform candidate running against the machine. And his name was Chuck Bernardini. And I just needed to get him attention. And I wrote these very sort of whimsical, funny ads using his name to get information out about him. And the guy who did the voiceover for the ads, great young comedic actor, ended up as the voice of Homer Simpson. So I feel like I launched him. Dini ad and went to Hollywood and said, "Look what I can do." But you know, and then I worked my way up, and so you know, a lot of it is just paying attention and learning from your experiences and leveraging your way up, understanding that you're not going to get. I think the big mistake some young people make is thinking that they can start at the top. You're not going to start at the top. You know, you got to work your way up, and there's joy in doing it.
Well, you also had a lot of joy in helping people in campaigns, and you've run an awful lot of campaigns and supported a number of candidates. We went through a lot of transition since you started helping people in the political process. One of those transitions was the role of money.
Yes.
But now we see the role of big data.
Yeah.
And could you tell us a little bit about the role of money, but more significantly, what is happening with the role of big data and the new media?
Yeah. Well, money was important then, but it's even more important now. Partly it's more important because media is so diffuse that it's really hard to get people's attention. It used to be you'd have a few networks and you could advertise on them, and compared to what you spend today, you could reach people pretty efficiently. Now it's far more expensive. You've got to spend more. You've got to have more coverage just to meet people, just to reach people. Politics has just become very, very expensive, and it's a big concern. I mean, I think anybody who thinks there's no impact of all this money is mistaken. I mean, Paul Simon used to talk back in the 80s about when I get to my hotel room, if I've got 10 messages and one's from a guy who gave me $1,000, I'm going to return that call. Now, it's almost a laughable story now because $1,000 probably wouldn't get a return call now. It's only gotten worse, and we probably unwittingly contributed to that because we were so concerned. In 2004, when John Kerry ran for president, you had this group of Swift Boat Veterans for Truth that are well known here in Texas. It started down here. And there was a lot of spending outside the political system, and we were worried that there would be spending outside of the prescribed system, the campaign finance system, and so we made decisions to go outside of that system. We raised a lot of money online, hundreds of millions of dollars online, but we also, we spent a lot of money. And, there is a kind of proliferation effect of that. And I think, it's a concern, and now we're waiting on the Supreme Court decision that would that would eliminate caps on overall giving. They may well do it. That's only going to contribute to that. It is a big concern, I think, because money does talk. You see it in Congress every day, and it's unhealthy. In terms of big data, technology has been, it's just exponentially increased, revolutionized since I began in politics. And it played a big role in our campaign in 2012 because we knew that the campaign, in our peculiar system, what happens is there are 8 or 9 states where there's an actual presidential race going on, and then the rest of us watch. And you concentrate all your resources in those 8 or 9 states, and they're swing states for a reason. They're going to be close. And one of the things that we did was we had 54 young analytics guys and gals in a corner of our campaign headquarters, and they were just crunching data all the time and developing voter files that had, there were always voter files, and you could get sort of the basic history of people, but we appended to that their history of giving and other information, and we were able to assign to about 35 million voters in these states probability scores as to what the likelihood of them voting for us would be, and it helped us target our efforts in a big way. It also helped us target our media in a big way. We used this data that was provided by set-top boxes on cable, from cable to make much more discerning judgments about where to put our TV money. And because of that, I think we were on like 60, I think the number is 60, don't hold me to this, but different cable outlets. The Romney campaign was much more conventional in its time buying. We say probably 15 or 20% on the buy because we were putting money into programming that wasn't obvious, but it was obvious to us that the people we wanted to get were watching this programming. So, I'll say Andy of Mayberry reruns at 2 in the morning are not where you'd put political advertising. But it turns out
I put all of mine.
that's where I spend all my time, but it's not where I put my But it turns out that, when you're trying to reach those voters who at the end of the election are undecided, they're actually not watching Meet the Press. They're not watching the news. They're watching other things. And the question is, how do you find them where they are? And the data collection helped us do this. And it also helped us predict where we were in the race much more, I think, with much more proficiency than the other side did. So we had a very clear sense. We were making thousands of calls a night. In addition to our regular polling, our analytics people were calling into each of these states 1,000 calls a night for several months before the election. We had another group that were doing statewide polls. We had 3 different sets of data going to check on each other. And our analytics people predicted within a point every single one of these swing states. So we were very confident. I don't have my mustache now because I got into a thing on television with Joe Scarborough, who said he was talking to his friends in the Republican Party, and he said, well, you're in trouble in Pennsylvania and Michigan and Minnesota. And I said, Joe, if we lose those states, I'll shave off my mustache, but if we win, you've got to grow one. And he said, well, I'll grow one if you win those states and Florida. And I said, okay, deal. So we did. And the next day he called and said, I'm not growing a mustache. He said, but I will contribute $10,000 to your wife's foundation, Cure, and they've been great, Joe and Mika, great to Cure. So I went back to my wife and I said, what do you think? She said, that's not enough. She said, if you should go back and say, if we can raise $1 million by the end of November, you will shave your mustache off on the air. So we did. We raised $1.2 million. And I shaved it off on national television, and I got 10 steps away from shaving it off. And my wife turned to me. We've been married for 33 years at the time, and she said, I always hated that thing anyway. And I said, you could have said something. She said, you wouldn't have done anything anyway. And I realized, I'm sure she wanted the money for epilepsy research, but I also think this was an elaborate scheme to get me shaved.
I have to ask you about some of the contemporaneous challenges. Washington, D.C. is
I'm happy to be in Texas.
practice. We're happy that you're in Texas. But do you have any insightful counsel that you could offer those of us who are watching with great interest? But I will admit this audience is probably, you could probably divide it, Fox News and MSNBC, and that seems to be
Is it like a wedding? As I listen to you, Andy, I'm happy that you welcome me to Texas, but you don't sound like you're from Texas.
I parked the car in Harvard Yard.
Yeah, good luck there. So, I don't know. My teams were out in April. So, look, we have a problem in our political system, and it's being reflected now in a way that is very menacing to the well-being of our economy, to the well-being of the global economy, to the well-being of the finances of individual Americans. And somewhere along the line, the notion of compromise became compromised, and it became a dirty word, at least with some on the extremes of both ends. But in this case, and I understand you've got Fox and MSNBC listeners, the resistance right today is largely in the Republican caucus, House caucus. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that, and we talked about some of them earlier. One of them is the way we elect members of Congress. We now have, so I heard some people talk about, well, Bill Clinton was able to work it through in 1995 after 20 days. But it's also worth noting that when Bill Clinton was president in 1995, there were 77 districts or so where he had won that had Republican members of Congress. There are 17 today. 17 today. In 80% of our congressional districts, there are no general elections to speak of. They may slate candidates, but there's no chance that the Republican or Democratic candidate will lose, depending on where they are. This is the art of gerrymandering and map drawing. And so in my state of Illinois, we gained 4 Democratic seats in the last election. In North Carolina, Republicans, I think, gained